Let's move on and talk about site roles and responsibilities. And Priya is going to talk about the newish requirements here.
Yes, thanks, Denise. So, yeah, indeed, newish is the right word for this particular section, right? Because there's a number of new requirements here, but many of them fall into the bucket of industry standards that are new to GCP. So, that's an important note. However, since they were codified in GCP, they raise some questions. And, Denise will talk a little bit about challenges in a moment. First, here you can see we have a new principle that roles and responsibilities must be clearly documented with subtasks that cover delegation, agreements, oversight. The new principle is echoed in the investigator's responsibility section as well, in the step that says that investigators may delegate trial related activities. R2 didn't actually say this, it implied it, but it didn't say it. So by stating this in R3 that investigators should maintain a list of people to whom activities were delegated is new there, and a very important point. The interesting part here, though, is that R3 now says that sponsors may support investigators by hiring service providers for them, but the investigator retains the final decision on whether the service provider is appropriate, right? So you can see that kind of joint, dual kind of responsibility there, working in partnership, the investigator and the sponsor. And also the investigator must ensure that delegated personnel are qualified, informed. Of course, they need to be trained on the trial. Even if the sponsor has hired them, the investigator has to ensure all of these things. And then the investigator must oversee the personnel, um, even if the sponsors hired them. Yes, it's a bit what I call yin yang here, right? So oversight can be risk based, right? So that's really important. And then finally, what I wanted to say is that the investigator is still required to maintain a record of delegations, but this also can be risk based. So where activities are performed as part of a clinical practice, a delegation record may not be required. So there's quite a lot going on here in terms of roles and responsibilities between the sponsor, the investigator, and maybe other roles, right, that are delegated as well. So this is a really nice one to get to know a bit more and really understand how this is done, how is it done currently, and what's changing for the team. Denise, I think we might have another poll here, so I'll hand over to Tracy and yourself.
Yeah, so while Tracy's getting the poll up, um, it is a lot to unpack here because we're talking about roles and responsibilities. And so my big question is, how do we differentiate between service providers who should be overseen by the sponsor and service providers that should be overseen by the investigator? And so, very simple question for you, is a central lab a provider that should be overseen by the sponsor or by an investigator? So please enter your response.
Okay, we'll end the poll now. I'll share the results.
All right, so 92% say sponsor, 8%. All right, I like the iconoclast. They say the investigator. I was expecting almost everyone to say the sponsor, of course, right? Because central labs are always overseen by the sponsor. It's just the way we've always done it. But the point I'm trying to make here is, why are we making that distinction? So central labs are handling human samples and they're alerting the PI to safety issues just like local labs are. If you think back to your SAT days and analogies, for those of you in the US, sorry, that was US centric, a central lab is to a local lab like a home health nurse is to an on-site nurse. But we think of central labs as vendors that are managed by the sponsor, and home health nurses as vendors that are delegated by the investigator, right? Even though the sponsor hires them. So why? Like, what are we basing this on? Because we need some principles in order to be able to implement R3, right? And know which vendors need to be delegated by the investigator, which need to be approved by the investigator, which need, to be overseen by the investigator. So I don't think we're going to be seeing investigators approving central labs moving forward, but it does point out how fuzzy our criteria are for determining who owns a particular service provider. Um, some other challenges here, we might need some clear documentation of the investigator's acceptance of service providers that we hire. And we also might increasingly run into situations where sponsor contracted resources might have to prove in some way that they are not biased, or we might have to come up with some ways to minimize bias. So Priya is going to go over some questions that we might expect.
Yes, thank you, Denise. So in the same fashion here, you can see, some questions that we can expect around, can you provide documentation that shows that each investigator approved the use of the home health nursing organization? Another question could be around the PI site. So how did the PI at site 001 determine which study-specific training was required for staff conducting the mobile vision clinic exams? So there's always this thing around training, right? Having a record. And perhaps another question could be, what steps did the sponsor take to ensure that staff it hired to enter the data at site X were free from bias? Okay, so interesting.
And I think that this goes to Kelly's question in the chat. I know you can't all see it, but Kelly asked, how will inspectors expect to see oversight of vendors documented under R3, especially when tasks are delegated? And I think that that's the big question, right? Like, we are going to have to train our investigators on what they should be doing and have them document somewhere how they are going to be overseeing resources that are hired by the sponsor. And that's very simple when we are hiring them a study coordinator, because they already have mechanisms in place to oversee the people that work at a site. But when we are hiring them a mobile vision clinic, or when we're hiring them a telehealth organization, we are going to have to help them come up with some kind of a written plan on how to do this. So here's the kind of storyboard that we might develop. This one just lists out for a particular study who the sponsor contracted to work under site supervision, how the PIs approved them, how they were delegated, trained, supervised, and then here at the end we have a couple of deviations that we're putting on the storyboard just so that we are aware of them. So that's the kind of storyboard that I would expect to see to address that very question.